So let's take a look at my software development machine from, well, I recently used it, not for way back when. This is a Socket 4 system with a Pentium OverDrive processor in there running at 133 megahertz. I was able to get it new and boxed, incredibly expensive, but I wanted it in my collection, so one of the few really expensive things I bought. And of course I loaded it up with the full 128 megabytes of RAM. Pretty sure all of it's cached, not entirely sure. In this particular system, it is running Windows NT 3.51 Workstation. Both CPU cache and motherboard cache are enabled. Starting Windows NT Workstation. I was actually really surprised by how good this operating system is, even though it was very limited and didn't have very much software written for it. And of course I have it fully updated to Service Pack 5. Really shouldn't run anything like DOS on this because of how much memory there is. 128 megs would be an absolute waste for DOS. And I'm surprised having 128 megs in here were put to use under NT. I'm surprised that the OS itself does consume a fair amount. I think just starting up, it's using between 16 and 20 megabytes of RAM. And like all my systems, I do have this connected to my NT4 domain. Makes it easier for me to share files amongst all my collection pieces. And I did change the background. I kind of prefer this background. And I went through trying to find software that was compatible with this operating system. So I do have Office on there, though that's also for developmental reasons. One of the things I wanted to develop or was have at the back of my mind is creating a game where all the data is stored in an Access database, all the save file, all the information. Not coming along too well, but you know. I do switch between using Microsoft Visual C++ 1.52, which was the last version I can create for DOS and Windows 3.1. It cannot do 32-bit, I don't think. I think that was for Visual C 2.0, which I at one point had on here. I think I actually got rid of it. The Microsoft compiler is actually rather simplistic, but very interesting. It's trying to load up some of the files that I had last open. I don't want it to. I hate how it does that. But it's essentially a multi-document interface, or an MDI, and you can open up files here, and you just type away in the editor. The editor has very limited functionality. Of course, back in the day, that all you needed was just something to type in your code. And at least it was graphical and worked in Windows, or you can play around in DOS. But the multitasking capability of Windows NT was very much needed, for me at least, when writing a lot of the code that I like to write. And of course, the Microsoft compiler, if you're not aware, it comes with a whole bunch of documentation, a language reference. You can look up anything you need to. Still learning writing some DOS and Windows 3.1 code, so it comes in very handy to have a lookup table right there. Was going to make some of my stuff Visual Basic, but I'm not too big of a fan of Visual Basic. I kind of prefer C and C++. It's much speedier. Visual Basic is definitely easier. At least as far as creating visual elements. But as far as doing some low-level stuff, it's a little convoluted. It can be done, but it's a little convoluted and a little difficult to load in and get it right, unless you have good documentation. It's not a bad little program. I wrote a couple games in it. I think I wrote a tic-tac-toe game in it, and it was okay. The Symantec compiler comes with both a 16-bit IDE and a 32-bit IDE. They're largely the same, it's just that this one's intended for running under Windows 3.1, 16-bit mode. 32-bit is intended for running under NT or even Windows 95, 98. This was released right around, I want to say, 96. So, and it comes with the same documentation that the Microsoft compiler comes with. And here it wants to load in a bunch of files that I've moved, and so it's angry about it. This editor is, do I still have the information there? Yeah. This editor is only slightly above the Microsoft one. Again, it's a very basic text editor. They have some highlighting, just like the Microsoft one does. As you can see, these are in blue for native commands. But nothing too fancy, which is one of the reasons why I ended up moving a lot of my development over to my modern machine, and I can use VS Code, and I use VNC to remote into my other machines to play around in testing and compiling. But this is what I would use for the longest time, trying to get the authentic programming experience. And of course, you load in Internet Explorer 4 or 5. 5 is the latest one you could run on Windows NT 351. But for some reason, I really like the look and the interface of 4.0. I like the larger buttons. I like the way it looks. And of course, FrogFind's a great search site. If you haven't played around with it already, I like to set it as the home page so I can just immediately start searching. So thank you very much to Action Retro and Mac84 for setting this up for us. Very useful. But this is just a quick look at my old programming machine. I don't think my favorite Windows utility runs under NT 351. I think Discover was only intended for Windows 3.1. I think it pukes if I try to load it under NT. Yeah, causes a general protection fault. I was going to show some fun information. I can still use the Windows NT diagnostics, which is very similar to the Microsoft diagnostics under DOS. It gives you registered owner, where it's installed in. Quick look at the hardware. I'm running an 800 by 632 bits. It's an x86 architecture, date, CPU steppings, x86 family. But definitely adding the OverDrive processor really helped with this performance, especially under NT 351. I kind of want to get a machine running a Pentium Pro doing NT 351 and or NT4, maybe even dual booting, because I had imagined that since these are pure 32-bit operating systems, they would probably perform really well under a Pentium Pro. And look at this, I've got 128 megs of RAM and only 80 or 88 megs or so free, 89 megs free. That's how much that's consumed just by some of my startup utilities. But I mean, from 30 to 89, yeah, you do need a lot. And once I get going, loading all my development environments, it can really consume a lot of memory. Loading a copy of Access or keeping track of information in an Excel spreadsheet or having multiple IDEs open, it can start consuming a lot of memory. I do also actually have a copy of the Microsoft assembler, or the macro assembler, MASM, so that I can actually assemble assembly files. I can write my assembly and I can compile it directly in here. And that's the interesting thing, is like with the Microsoft compiler, will only do limited amounts of inline assembly, and any like modern command that it doesn't recognize, like it only recognizes up to 46 class machines. So if I write inline assembly for a Pentium, it won't compile it because it doesn't recognize those Pentium instructions. So I have to drop down here to compile an object file and then include the object file in my Microsoft project. Well, not project file, not Microsoft project, but in the C++ project, in the project of the program I'm working on. And that's one advantage that the Symantec compiler actually has over the Microsoft one. The Symantec compiler will recognize all the way up to a Pentium, and you can write inline assembly, including Pentium assembly code, and I think it might even do some 686 limited support for it. But it'll compile and run 586 assembly code, and it recognizes all the mnemonics and instructions and be able to run it right there for you and compile it for you. And you don't even have to do inline. You can actually include .asm files, and it'll compile .asm files. It searches for the Microsoft macro assembler, and it runs that and creates an object file. So it does it automatically for you. You don't have to do it as a separate step like you do with the Microsoft compiler. But with the Symantec compiler, you can actually include an ASM, and it'll do it all for you and compile it and include it in your project and compile it into your final code. So it's super handy there. That was one of the reasons why I started using the Symantec compiler. Wanted to use the Digital Mars compiler. I do like it, but it's a little quirky in that it doesn't support, well, I don't want to say it doesn't support, that's not the right word, but you have to turn on case sensitivity in order to compile a lot of your programs. Otherwise, some of the header files won't include properly or won't compress properly or compile properly. And it's very confusing, and I don't like to leave case sensitivity enabled. I like to leave it disabled for other reasons. So I kind of shied away from using the Digital Mars compiler, even though it is really nice and more up-to-date, and I know it does support the 686 instruction set, being that it was released much later, right around 97, 98, so it supports 686 just fine. But, you know, for writing my DOS and Windows 3.1 applications and maybe even some early Windows 95 applications, the Symantec compiler works just fine for my needs. Would love to have shown you more, but it looks like there's not much I'm going to get out of this. Nothing graphical, nothing cool that I can show you. But this is my Windows NT Workstation running a Pentium OverDrive for a socket 4. Performs quite nicely. As you can tell here, you know, I'm double-clicking stuff. Everything's quite speedy. I installed Sid Meier's Civilization 2. That does work under here. You can run it without the CD. You won't get a lot of the animations, though. But I do have the CD, and you can put the CD in, and it works. But otherwise, that's my development system, and that's a quick look at it. Thank you very much.